A thick gray fog hung over Riverest that morning, settling over the bare trees and casting the old churchyard in a dull metallic light. The snow from last night had turned slushy, turning the path to the cemetery into a trail of muddy footprints and cold puddles. But none of that registered for David Parker. He barely felt the bite of winter air or the dampness that seeped through his shoes. He was numb, his heart ripped apart by a grief too raw for words. 6-year-old Haley Parker was gone. The little girl with the honey blonde curls, the one who used to dance around the kitchen, laughing at her own jokes, had been stolen by a catastrophic seizure only 2 nights before. The doctors had told him it was hopeless. The world had moved on. Today they would bury her, and all the joy she brought with her. The small crowd gathered under umbrellas and dark coats, their faces pale and pinched, sharing whispered condolences. Some neighbors lingered on the edges, some out of genuine care, others drawn by curiosity. The minister's voice trembled as he spoke of God's plan and the mysteries of fate, but David couldn't hear him. The only thing he heard, over and over, was the echo of his daughter's laughter and the sudden, suffocating silence that followed her last breath. Standing near the grave, David gripped the cold metal leash of Scout, Haley's German shepherd. Scout was a rescue, a big dog with scars behind his ear and haunted eyes. Some in the town still eyed him warily. He had once bitten a man who tried to take Haley's backpack at the park. But Haley had trusted him with her life. She used to say, "Scout's my superhero, Daddy. He always knows when I need him." As the minister's words faded and the first shovelfuls of earth fell on the pale wood of the coffin, a strange tension filled the air. Scout whined, tugging at the leash, his body rigid. David tried to calm him, kneeling down to scratch his fur, but the dog wouldn't be soothed. Suddenly, Scout let out a guttural, piercing bark that echoed across the cemetery. Heads turned, annoyed and startled. David tried to hold on, but with a desperate yank, Scout tore the leash free from David's grip. Gasps rang out as Scout sprinted toward the open grave. He leapt onto the low mound of earth, claws scrabbling at the coffin lid, barking and howling with a primal urgency that chilled the mourners. Some called it chaos, others called it madness, but for David all he saw was pain, a dog grieving the only child who'd ever truly loved him. "Somebody get that dog out of here!" someone shouted. "He's just in pain, let him be," whispered another. The funeral director hurried forward, flustered, but Scout wouldn't move. He pawed and scratched at the coffin, nose pressed to the wood, letting out yelps that sounded almost like words. David's brother, Mike Parker, pushed through the crowd. He hadn't seen Mike in nearly 2 years, not since an argument at Thanksgiving drove them apart. Mike looked harder, older now, his jaw set in the way it always was when he sensed trouble. "David, let me—" Mike started. But David shook his head, voice breaking. "I can't do this, Mike, I can't." Then Mike knelt beside Scout, placing a steady hand on the dog's back. "Hey, big guy, what are you trying to tell us?" Scout whined, his whole body trembling. Mike pressed his ear close to the coffin, his veteran instincts kicking in, picking up the subtle urgency in Scout's cries. Suddenly, he stood up, voice loud and clear. "Stop! Open the coffin, right now!" A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. The funeral director stared at him in horror. "Sir, please, this isn't—" "I'm not asking," Mike snapped, his eyes blazing. "Something's wrong." Dr. Alan Reed, the town physician who'd pronounced Haley dead, strode over in a fury. "This is unthinkable. You're traumatizing everyone. Let the family grieve in peace." But Scout wouldn't stop. He barked so furiously that even those who wanted to shoo him away now hesitated, caught in the force of his panic. Haley's grandmother broke into sobs, clinging to her son. David looked between Mike and Scout, his face a mask of agony. "Please," he said quietly, almost to himself. "If there's any chance, any hope at all." For a long moment nobody moved. Then Mike took charge, kneeling by the coffin and calling out, "Help me open it!" It was madness. It was hope. The undertaker, trembling, obeyed. The world seemed to hold its breath as the screws came out. The lid was lifted, and the hush became absolute. Everyone expected only pain, but as the coffin opened, Scout leaped forward, nose pressed to Haley's face. He let out a low, anxious whine, then suddenly, the faintest movement. A twitch in Haley's lips. A whisper of breath fogged the air. Her fingers twitched once, then again. Gasps, shouts, confusion. Someone screamed for help. Mike roared for an ambulance. David, frozen, stared in disbelief as life crept back into his daughter's cheeks. Dr. Reed went pale, stumbling backward as Scout refused to move, his eyes wild but triumphant. In the chaos that followed, sirens wailed. EMTs raced across the slushy ground. The crowd, once sure of death, now watched in terror and awe as a little girl's heartbeat defied their certainty. As the ambulance doors closed on Haley and her faithful protector, one question rang through every mind in Riverest. If you heard the faintest heartbeat in the silence, would you listen, or would you let hope die? The old iron gates of Riverest Cemetery stood wide open as the ambulance roared away, red lights splashing across the snow-streaked ground and the faces of stunned mourners. For a long time, no one spoke. People just stared at the empty grave, at the muddy chaos, at each other, trying to process what had happened. Some wiped tears of confusion or relief. Others just looked afraid, as if they'd witnessed something unnatural, something their hearts weren't ready to accept. Inside the ambulance, the world became a blur of motion and urgent noise. EMTs swarmed around Haley, whose tiny frame lay shivering on the stretcher, skin pale but unmistakably warm. Scout, soaked and trembling, pressed his nose against her hand as the paramedics debated whether to force him out. But every time they tried, Haley's pulse seemed to flutter. A warning, a sign. Mike's voice boomed. "He stays. He's her best chance." David, holding Haley's other hand, was too stunned to speak. He kept whispering her name over and over, as if afraid she might disappear again. In the chaos, he caught Scout's eye. The dog seemed to say, "Trust me, we're not done yet." When they reached the hospital, everything turned frantic. The ER bustled with a kind of electricity no one could name. Half dread, half awe. Nurses and doctors clustered around the gurney, shouting questions, trading orders, their professionalism strained by the strangeness of the moment. They had never seen a case like this. A girl pronounced dead, now breathing, her skin pinkening with every moment. A nurse ran for Dr. Alan Reed, who stormed in red-faced and breathless. "What is this circus?" Reed barked. "You can't just open a sealed coffin. I signed her death certificate." Mike stood between the gurney and the doctor, refusing to budge. "You signed it wrong." Reed's eyes narrowed. "This is a disgrace. We're going to have a lawsuit on our hands." But as the staff prepped Haley for tests, another voice rose above the clamor. Dr. Rachel Williams, newly transferred to Riverest from Boston, looked at Haley, then at the dog who wouldn't leave her side. "What's this dog's story?" David cleared his throat. "Scout. He's a rescue. He's always protected her. He was the first to know she was still alive." Williams nodded, her eyes sharp and open in a way Reed's never were. "Sometimes animals notice what we don't." She turned to the team. "Let's run full neuro, cardiac, and toxicology panels. Move now!" While the medical team raced to work, the news outside began to spread like wildfire. Someone had filmed Scout's desperate leap onto the coffin, and within minutes, the video hit social media. #Riverist Miracle began trending as strangers across the country argued in comments and threads. Miracle or medical error? Was it possible for a child to be buried alive by mistake? Did science have an answer for a dog sensing a heartbeat when doctors could not? Back in the hospital, the debate raged with even more urgency. Reed, frantic about his reputation, argued that Haley's state was cataleptic, possibly terminal, and that prolonging care would only hurt her more. He tried to order Scout removed from the room, but each time Scout was pulled away, Haley's monitors spiked, her heart racing, her breath catching. Williams, reading the data, pushed back. "The dog stays. He's alerting to something. If you can't see it, let's get someone who can." The hospital director arrived, torn between the demands of legal liability and the eyes of a suddenly watching world. "We need to follow protocol," he warned, glancing at the phone buzzing in his hand. "But we also need to avoid a media disaster." As word of Haley's revival spread, satellite trucks from Chicago and local reporters began parking outside. Candlelight vigils sprang up on the hospital steps. In the chaos, no one noticed the old women from church praying in the corner, or the young nurse quietly holding Haley's mother's rosary. David stayed by Haley's side, exhausted and running on adrenaline. For hours, he watched as doctors ran test after test, as Williams argued for more time, and as Reed's anger simmered. He thought of all the nights Haley had slept curled up with Scout, the way she whispered secrets into his fur. He remembered the time Scout barked and woke them all before Haley's first seizure, a warning that saved her life. How many times had he doubted Scout? How many times had he ignored his own gut, trusting only what the world called science? Outside, the story kept growing. Haley's grandmother gave a tearful interview on TV. "We thought we lost her, but that dog, he wouldn't let us say goodbye. He knew. God sent us a sign." The video went viral, and suddenly, people all over the country were sending prayers, money, and angry demands for answers. Was it a miracle or the biggest medical scandal the town had ever seen? Inside the hospital, time stretched and bent. Minutes felt like hours. Mike, usually the stoic one, began to crack, his tough shell giving way to anxiety and hope. He watched as Scout shifted from Haley's side to the foot of the bed, as if guarding every possible entrance to her soul. He whispered to David, "She's fighting. Don't let anyone give up on her." And then, just after midnight, the tension hit its peak. Reed marched into the room with hospital security, determined to remove Scout once and for all. "He's a health hazard. If you don't get him out, I'll call animal control." Before anyone could react, Haley's heart monitor let out a sharp, steady beep. Her fingers twitched. Scout's ears perked up. He barked, but this time it sounded less desperate and more triumphant. Williams rushed in, eyes wide. "She's responding! Get me neuro and ICU now!" Security hesitated, looking to Reed, then to the monitors, then to Williams's confident face. The world outside watched, waiting for a miracle or a tragedy. David fell to his knees beside Haley, tears streaming down his face. "Please, baby, please come back to us." In that moment, the war for Haley's life had only just begun. But in the chaos of the hospital, one thing was clear. The line between hope and heartbreak had never been thinner. And in the halls of Riverist, everyone, doctors, family, strangers, and the loyal heart of a dog, would have to decide what they believed in most: protocol or the possibility of a miracle. The hospital corridors pulsed with anxiety, whispers, and uncertainty as news of Haley Parker's revival spread from department to department. Riverest General, a place where most emergencies involved farm accidents or winter slips, now found itself the reluctant stage for a national spectacle. Doctors, nurses, and administrators huddled in corners, debating medical ethics, hospital liability, and, most surprisingly, the unorthodox role of a scarred German shepherd in the pediatric ICU. Inside Haley's room, David Parker hovered like a ghost. He'd barely slept since that awful funeral morning, afraid that if he closed his eyes, he might wake to find his daughter gone again. Mike slept in a battered chair by the window, boots still on, one arm draped protectively over Scout. The dog never moved far from Haley's bed. The medical staff soon learned that any time they tried to move him, the monitors would beep with sudden spikes in Haley's heart rate, or her oxygen levels would dip. It was almost as if Scout sensed trouble before the machines. That morning, Dr. Rachel Williams arrived with a fresh printout of Haley's EEG. She found David sitting on the edge of the bed, gently brushing Haley's hair while whispering stories about the puppy Scout once rescued from a rain gutter. Her brain activity is faint, but it's there, Dr. Williams said quietly, showing David the peaks and valleys on the graph. She's fighting, David. She needs time. David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Williams knelt beside Scout, scratching him behind the ear. "Thank you, buddy," she murmured. "You saved her once. Let's see if we can do it again." Suddenly the door banged open. Dr. Alan Reed strode in with a hospital administrator and 2 members of security. His face was a mask of self-righteous anger. "This is a pediatric ICU, not a circus," Reed barked, glaring at the dog. "I've tolerated this long enough. Remove the animal, immediately." Williams stepped forward, her tone icy but controlled. "With respect, Dr. Reed, the data shows Scout is alerting us to issues before they occur. He's more accurate than half our monitors." Reed's voice rose. "We're running a hospital, not a kennel. If something happens, the liability is on us. I want that animal out, and I want the family counseled about end-of-life care. Haley's chances are minimal. This is false hope." Mike stood up, shoulders squared, voice cold. "Doc, with all due respect, you already called my niece dead once. Why not sit this round out?" The room tensed. Security shifted uncertainly, glancing at the monitors, then at Scout, whose hackles rose protectively. Williams pulled up recent charts, pointing out several times Scout had reacted moments before Haley's vitals crashed. "We're monitoring everything. If Scout's here and alert, so are we. If you remove him and something happens, the press outside will hear every detail." The administrator blanched at the threat of more bad press. After an awkward pause, Reed stormed out, muttering about unscientific nonsense. After the confrontation, a quiet settled. David slumped into a chair, exhaustion and dread pooling in his eyes. Mike sat next to him. "Don't let Reed bully you. Haley's tough. You're tougher." David shook his head. "What if he's right? What if we're making it worse?" Mike's jaw tightened. "No. You listen to Scout. That dog never quits on her, neither do we." Scout, sensing the tension, placed his paw on David's knee and stared up at him with steady, gentle eyes. For a moment, the fear in the room broke, replaced by a fragile thread of hope. Hours blurred into one another. Nurses, some sympathetic, some skeptical, came and went. Williams remained, working late shifts, consulting with specialists from larger hospitals, pushing for advanced diagnostics that Reed had previously denied. New machines were wheeled in. Scout learned to ignore the alarms, focusing only on Haley's subtle changes, her twitching fingers, a shift in breathing, the scent of adrenaline that seemed to warn him before any human could notice. One night, Haley's oxygen saturation plummeted without warning. The machines began to beep, but Scout was already up, barking urgently, pacing at the side of the bed. The nurse on duty, a woman named Carla, tried to shoo him away, then realized the monitors lagged behind Scout's warning by at least 20 seconds. She pressed the emergency call, and Williams arrived, stabilizing Haley with swift, decisive actions. Afterward, Carla stayed late, entering a detailed note in the medical file. Scout's alert directly preceded patient's oxygen drop. Consider service animal protocol. But outside the ICU, not everyone was convinced. Reed convened a meeting of the hospital's ethics board, accusing the family of clinging to false hope and distracting the staff. He lobbied to have end-of-life care initiated and began pressuring the administrator, citing resource allocation and risk of infection. Rumors swirled. Some nurses whispered that Reed had pushed to end care for other children with poor prognoses. The local media caught wind of the growing conflict. Cameras appeared outside the hospital, broadcasting live as a divided town watched and argued. Was Haley's case a miracle or an expensive mistake? Should families have the right to defy medical consensus? Was Scout a hero or a distraction? Back in Haley's room, David and Mike braced themselves. Every day was a new battle, fighting for more time, more tests, more hope. Williams became their champion, risking her own standing to advocate for Haley. She argued with Reed in front of the board, citing emerging research on animal-assisted medical care. "You call it superstition," she told him, "but every time that dog barks, we save her again. Maybe it's time you let science catch up with compassion." One evening, after a particularly brutal board meeting, Mike found David sitting at Haley's bedside, staring out the window as the snow fell in thick, silent sheets. "What if we lose?" David whispered. "What if they make us give up?" Mike put a steady hand on his brother's shoulder. "Then we fight harder, for Haley, for every kid whose parents never got a chance to fight." Scout climbed onto the bed beside Haley, curling up next to her as if refusing to let her go. The warmth of his body, the rhythm of his breath, seemed to fill the room with a promise. As long as there was even a faint heartbeat, hope wasn't dead. And in the deep winter silence, with Riverist's future hanging in the balance, a small family and their loyal dog faced off against the system, refusing to let protocol write the final chapter of Haley's story. A cold drizzle traced icy lines down the windows of Children's Memorial Hospital, smearing the lights of Riverist into a gray watercolor blur. They had transferred Haley under cover of night, hoping to shield her from the rising media frenzy and give her a better shot at advanced care. The move was silent, urgent, and surreal, like sneaking hope through the back door of despair. David Parker felt like he was sleepwalking. Since Haley's sudden return from the edge of death, time had lost meaning. There were hours he couldn't account for, entire days blurred by exhaustion, guilt, and an ache that never left his chest. He sat at Haley's bedside in the children's ward, hands wrapped around a mug of hospital coffee that had long since gone cold. The walls around him were lined with children's drawings, cartoon murals, and faded motivational posters that read, "Hope heals," and "You are never alone." But the reality was starker. Machines clicked and whirred, families whispered, and grief hung thick in the recycled air. Mike, who'd insisted on riding in the ambulance with Scout, was a constant quiet presence. Sometimes he just sat in the corner, staring at the snow falling outside. Sometimes he tried to joke, telling Haley stories about army buddies and the dog that once outran an armored truck. But more often, he just watched. Over Haley, over David, over Scout, guarding the family with the same intensity that had kept him alive through war. The rift between the brothers, though still raw, had faded into the background, replaced by a silent agreement. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Some nights, David would catch Mike staring at Haley with a pain in his eyes that looked suspiciously like regret. Other nights, it was gratitude, thankful for a second chance to make things right, to stand up for his niece in a way he hadn't done before. Scout never left Haley's side. Nurses, skeptical at first, soon grew accustomed to the sight of the big German shepherd curled up against Haley's legs, his chin resting gently on her lap. Whenever a nurse or doctor entered the room, Scout's eyes tracked them with an intelligence that was almost human. If Haley twitched, Scout was the first to notice. If a monitor beeped, he'd raise his head, ears perked, ready to alert at the slightest change. It became clear, even to the most hardened staff, that Scout was more than just a pet. He was a lifeline, a sentinel in the darkness. One morning, as David traced his daughter's fingers and whispered another story, he broke down. The pain in his voice filled the room, but there was no one else to hear it. No one but Mike, who stood at the window, and Scout, who nuzzled Haley's hand with a gentle whine. "I should have seen it, Mike," David whispered. "I should have known something was wrong that night. I should have fought harder." Mike didn't respond right away. He simply crossed the room, placed a strong hand on David's shoulder, and let the silence stretch between them. "You did what you could, Dave. We both did. And you're here now. That's what matters." For a moment, the brothers just breathed, their grief mingling with the sterile air, unspoken but understood. Dr. Rachel Williams visited every day, her presence a small anchor in the chaos. She brought updates, some hopeful, some grim. Haley's EEG showed minimal improvement, but her vital signs remained steady. Williams pushed for more tests, arguing with the hospital's ethics board and advocating fiercely for more time. It was clear she believed in Haley and in Scout. "Some people heal slow," she told David one night, her hand lingering on Haley's chart. "But sometimes, hope's the only medicine that works." Scout seemed to understand every word. He responded to Haley's breathing, to the subtle shifts in her color and temperature. When her pulse faltered, he'd nudge her arm until a nurse came running. One nurse, a young woman named Lila, began bringing Scout small treats and sneaking him bits of her sandwich on lunch breaks. "He's the best nurse we've got," she joked, earning a tired but grateful smile from David. Haley's room became a strange oasis in the hospital, equal parts sorrow and sanctuary. Other parents stopped by, sometimes just to watch Scout and whisper about the miracle child. Some brought stories of their own, children saved by chance, by stubbornness, by faith. The Parkers' story spread quietly through the halls, the girl who'd come back, the dog who'd never given up. On a particularly gray afternoon, Mike found David sitting in the visitors' lounge, head in hands. Mike slid into the seat beside him and quietly handed him a cup of real coffee from the cafe down the block. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I keep replaying everything in my head," David said finally. "Did I miss a sign? Did I give up too soon? Was I wrong to believe the doctors?" Mike sipped his coffee. "I've learned something in the Army. Sometimes the experts get it wrong. You trust your gut, or you trust your training. That's all you can do." David let out a shaky laugh. "What if my gut's broken?" Mike nudged him, a rare smile flickering. "Then you trust Scout. He hasn't been wrong yet." As the days stretched on, hope and grief danced their uneasy waltz in Haley's hospital room. David read stories aloud, fairy tales, superhero comics, even old birthday cards. Sometimes, as dusk fell, he'd put on Haley's favorite song, letting the music drift softly through the room while Scout's tail thumped in rhythm. It was in these quiet moments that the smallest seeds of hope began to sprout. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, David noticed Haley's fingers twitch in time with the music. He froze, not daring to breathe, afraid it was only his imagination. But Scout noticed too. He nudged her hand, whining gently until a nurse came to check. The monitor registered a faint spike. Lila rushed to find Dr. Williams, who arrived in a hurry, her eyes wide. She checked Haley's reflexes, gently pressing her fingers, watching for any sign. "That's something," she murmured, half to herself, half to the family. "It's small, but it's real. Keep talking to her, keep believing." Word spread quietly among the staff. Some rolled their eyes, others paused a little longer at the door, watching the miracle unfold. Williams doubled down, requesting even more advanced therapies. Reed, his authority waning, tried to block her at every turn, but the tide in the hospital had shifted. The nurses rallied behind Haley and behind Scout. Late at night, Mike would sit with Haley, telling her stories of the mountains, of rescue missions and dogs who always found their way home. He'd confess the things he couldn't say during the day, the guilt, the hope, the promise to never leave her again. And Scout, as if understanding every word, would nuzzle closer, his heartbeat steady and strong against Haley's side. Outside, the snow fell heavier. The world waited. But inside the small hospital room, grief slowly began to give way to hope, one heartbeat at a time. The snowstorm that blanketed Riverest only seemed to intensify the fever of controversy raging inside and outside Children's Memorial. What had started as a private family crisis was now the subject of national headlines and online debates. Haley's story, carried by the wind and the web, divided the small town and soon the entire country. Was she the child saved by a miracle? Or was her case a glaring example of medical incompetence? And what did it mean for everyone else when hope and science collided in such a public, messy spectacle? By midweek, the hospital lobby was a maze of TV cameras, reporters, and local townspeople clutching candles and homemade signs. Some read, "Trust the science, let her go in peace," while others proclaimed, "Hope is alive, thank you, Scout." The media vans parked outside in the slush were matched by a steady stream of supporters, some coming from neighboring counties just to light a candle for Haley. There were whispered prayers and loud arguments, impassioned speeches at the courthouse steps, and even a radio talk show host who camped out in the hospital parking lot. Inside, David and Mike felt the weight of all that attention. Every decision, every statement was scrutinized, recorded, and dissected by people they'd never met. The hospital's legal department grew increasingly uneasy. Their chief counsel, an icy woman named Carol Jeffries, summoned David to a tense meeting one morning. She spoke softly, her words sharp as scalpels. "Mr. Parker, the hospital can no longer absorb the risk. Dr. Reed and the Ethics Board are united in their recommendation. It's time to consider comfort care for Haley." David stared at the contract she slid across the table, the words "do not resuscitate" flashing like a warning. His hands trembled. "I won't sign," he said, voice hoarse. "She's still fighting." Mike, sitting beside him, leaned forward. "If you push him, you'll have a lawsuit, and the whole country will know. Or maybe you want that. Free press, right?" Carol's lips tightened. "This isn't about publicity. It's about resources, liability, and standards of care. Dr. Williams has already exceeded protocol." Mike cut her off, voice rising. "Protocol? Reed buried her once. You want to do it again?" But even as the brothers resisted, new pressures emerged. The hospital administration began hinting they could call Child Protective Services if David refused to act in Haley's best interest. The threat felt both surreal and cruel. On the ward, whispers of another kind spread among the nurses. Some remembered Dr. Reed's reputation, quiet rumors that he'd recommended ending care for children who later defied the odds. It was Nurse Lila, emboldened by the unfolding miracle, who found the courage to act. She called a local reporter and shared an anonymous tip about Reed's history. 2 other cases in the past 3 years where families claimed Reed gave up too soon. The town, once a sleepy crossroads, was now a powder keg. At the local diner, arguments broke out over breakfast. Was it cruel to keep fighting, or crueler to give up? The mayor called for calm, but everyone seemed to pick a side. When a social media post accusing Reed of malpractice went viral, the hospital PR team scrambled to control the narrative. They issued statements emphasizing their commitment to family-centered care. But the damage was done. Then something unexpected happened. A group of families with similar stories, children who'd awakened after being given no hope, came forward. They held a candlelight vigil outside the hospital, holding photos of their sons and daughters. Some brought their children, alive and healthy, to thank Scout and the Parker family for their courage. One mother, tears shining on her cheeks, handed David an envelope. "My daughter was in a coma for 5 days," she whispered. "They told me to let go too. If I had, she wouldn't be here. Don't give up." Within days, a petition was launched demanding a full investigation into Reed's practices and supporting Haley's continued care. Signatures poured in, first by the dozen, then by the thousands. Donations arrived through crowdfunding sites, offering to cover Haley's mounting medical bills. Local businesses donated meals, toys, and flowers. Scout became a folk hero. Someone posted a drawing of him as guardian angel of Riverist, and soon children came to the hospital just to catch a glimpse of the legendary dog. But the pressure cut both ways. Reed, feeling the ground shift beneath him, doubled down. He filed a formal complaint against Dr. Williams, accusing her of reckless disregard for medical standards. Williams, undeterred, fought back, citing Haley's continued responses, her subtle improvements, and the importance of listening to the patient, even when that patient can't speak for herself. One evening, as the town argued and the hospital board debated, David slipped into the chapel. The tiny room was dark and silent except for the flicker of votive candles. Mike found him there, staring at the stained glass window. "Feels like the whole world's against us," David murmured. Mike sat beside him. "Not the whole world. Just the ones who think hope is a waste of time." David's voice broke. "What if they're right, Mike? What if we're just dragging this out because we can't let go?" Mike gripped his brother's shoulder, his own voice steady but raw. "You remember what Mom used to say? Miracles look a lot like stubbornness until they happen. Haley's still here, Scout's still fighting, and so are we." As the snow kept falling, the battle for Haley's life became a crucible not just for the Parkers, but for all of Riverist. Old rivalries, buried resentments, and fragile alliances surfaced. There were late-night phone calls from old friends, strangers who sent letters or stood vigil outside the hospital, and families who had never before dared to hope now rallying in the cold. In Haley's room, Scout remained steadfast. He bristled when new staff entered, and sometimes he barked at shadows, as if warning off the forces that wanted to silence hope. Nurses drew lots for who got to watch over Haley and her hero dog, a coveted assignment now. Even the most skeptical among them found themselves rooting for a miracle. And so, as winter gripped Riverist, the Parkers, their loyal dog, and a suddenly united community found themselves in the middle of a fight that was no longer just about one little girl. It was about every voice that had ever been told, "There's nothing left to do." It was about proving, together, that sometimes hope is its own kind of medicine, and that even in a world divided by doubt and fear, there is a power in choosing to believe. Winter in Riverist had always been relentless, but nothing felt as endless as the waiting. Days bled into nights under the cold fluorescent glow of Children's Memorial. For David Parker, every hour felt like a test of faith, hope, and endurance. The community outside waged its battle, but inside Haley's room, the real war was the silent one, fought between a little girl's heartbeat and the darkness threatening to claim her. Scout was the constant in that room. If the doctors or nurses were late, Scout would whine or bark, pressing up against Haley as if his sheer will could keep her alive. Sometimes, as David drifted in and out of uneasy sleep in the bedside chair, he'd awaken to find Scout resting his chin on Haley's arm, eyes focused and unblinking, ears twitching at every beep from the monitors. It had been weeks. The news crews had grown bored with the slow progress, and the crowd outside dwindled as the days passed with little change. But for those inside, every flicker, every shift in Haley's vitals was monumental. Dr. Williams and Nurse Lila never gave up. Williams, stubborn as ever, spent hours at Haley's side, poring over her EEGs, ordering new tests, and fiercely protecting Scout's place in the room. It was in the early hours of a bitterly cold morning when the breakthrough came. A storm rattled the windows, gusts of wind whistling down the hospital corridors. David was dozing, forehead pressed to Haley's blankets, when he was startled awake by the sound of Scout whining, high, anxious, insistent. The dog paced from the head of the bed to the foot, then jumped up gently, placing his nose against Haley's hand. David sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What is it, boy?" Scout let out a sharp, short bark. That same moment, Haley's hand twitched. At first, David thought he'd imagined it. A trick of the mind, the kind of hope-fueled vision he'd suffered before. But then it happened again. Her fingers curled, just a fraction, as Scout licked them softly. David's heart leapt into his throat. He shouted for help, his voice hoarse but full of frantic hope. "Dr. Williams! Somebody!" She moved. Haley moved. The room exploded into controlled chaos. Nurses rushed in, followed by Dr. Williams, who, bleary-eyed but alert, pushed past them to Haley's side. Williams examined Haley's hand, then called for a series of tests, her hands shaking with excitement. "Get the neuro team! Move!" Within minutes, the room filled with staff, everyone tense and expectant. Scout pressed himself even closer to Haley, refusing to be shooed away, as if to anchor her to the world. Williams spoke quietly but firmly. "Haley, if you can hear me, squeeze my fingers." For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, just as the nurses exchanged worried glances, Haley's hand closed, softly but unmistakably, around Williams's fingers. A collective gasp filled the room. Lila burst into tears, hands over her mouth. Williams's eyes shone with fierce joy. "She's in there. She's fighting." David fell to his knees at the side of the bed, tears streaming down his face. "You did it, baby girl. I knew you could." The next hours were a blur of activity. Haley's responses grew stronger. She blinked, opened her eyes for a split second, then drifted off again. But each time, Scout was there, whining or nuzzling her arm, coaxing her back to the surface. As dawn broke, casting weak sunlight through the frost-covered window, something extraordinary happened. Haley's eyelids fluttered. Her gaze, glassy but searching, fell on Scout. Her lips parted, dry and cracked, and a tiny sound escaped, a whisper barely more than a breath. "Scout." The entire room went silent. David clung to her hand, sobbing. Scout let out a joyful bark and wagged his tail furiously, nearly knocking over an IV stand. Nurse Lila called Dr. Williams, who was already on her way, having been alerted by the commotion. "She said his name," Lila exclaimed, her face lit up with tears and relief. "She said Scout!" Williams smiled, the tension of weeks easing from her shoulders. She knelt beside Haley and Scout, her voice trembling with awe. "Welcome back, Haley. We missed you." The news spread through the hospital like wildfire. Staff who'd once doubted now came by the door just to catch a glimpse of the miracle child. Dr. Reed, confronted by the undeniable evidence, found himself the subject of whispers and sidelong glances. For the first time in weeks, there was hope in every corner of the building. David's phone lit up with messages. Neighbors, friends, reporters, and even complete strangers sending congratulations and prayers. The crowd outside, emboldened by the news, returned with candles and cheers. Signs reading "Haley's Hope" and "Thank you, Scout" appeared in the hospital windows. But the victory was more than just a medical milestone. It was personal. David and Mike hugged for the first time in years, the long rift between them finally bridged by joy and relief. Mike called it the best damn comeback I've ever seen. Even the nurses joined in, clapping and crying as Haley slowly began to move her hands and feet, responding to their voices and her father's touch. Dr. Williams wasted no time. She ordered a new battery of treatments, gentle physical therapy, speech exercises, and gradual reduction of sedation. Each day, Haley improved a little more. Scout remained at her side, always alert, always the first to catch any sign of fatigue or distress. His presence became legend throughout the hospital. Families with sick children came to see him, hoping for a touch of his magic. Haley's recovery was not easy. There were setbacks, long nights of pain, confusion, and frustration. But every time she faltered, Scout was there. Her anchor, her friend, her miracle. And through it all, David never stopped believing. "One more day," he'd whisper every night, brushing her hair as Scout curled up beside them. "Just give us one more day." As the snow melted and the first hints of spring appeared, Haley found her voice again. Weak at first, but growing stronger each day, she told her father about her dreams, of bright fields and a dog always by her side. She asked about the world outside, about the people cheering for her, and especially about Scout, her hero. The hospital staff began to call Haley's room the room where hope lives. Doctors and nurses from other departments stopped by, and administrators, even those who'd once opposed Scout's presence, now praised his role in Haley's survival. The story swept the nation once more, but this time the headlines were different. "Miracle in Riverist. Dog saves girl's life." People everywhere wanted to know about the girl who came back, and the dog who never gave up. And as David stood at the window, watching Haley practice moving her fingers while Scout watched protectively, he realized something. Hope isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a heartbeat, a whisper, a wagging tail in the silence, a reminder that miracles are possible, even when the world has given up. It didn't take long for Haley's miracle to spark a different kind of storm inside Children's Memorial and throughout Riverist. The viral headlines had turned from whispers of hope to demands for answers. As Haley's eyes opened wider and her voice grew stronger, so did the chorus of voices asking how this could have happened in the first place, and who was responsible. Dr. Alan Reed, who'd once wielded authority in the hospital's marble corridors, found himself surrounded by suspicion. What began as quiet gossip among nurses had turned into open accusations. Parents of former patients came forward, sharing stories of Reed's brisk end-of-life recommendations and his tendency to dismiss families who dared question his prognosis. A handful of nurses, emboldened by the groundswell of support for Haley and Scout, gathered documentation, incident reports, memos, and a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Among them, Lila became a reluctant hero, her anonymous tip now fueling a growing investigation. The local media, hungry for a new angle, latched on to the brewing scandal. Headlines appeared: Riverist doctor under scrutiny after miracle case. Dog exposes hospital malpractice. The state medical board quietly began a preliminary review, sending investigators to interview staff and comb through years of records. The hospital board, desperate to save face, scheduled an emergency meeting. Mike, ever the fighter, became the family's unofficial spokesman. He sat for interviews, his gravelly voice carrying the steady conviction of a man who'd seen too much to ever back down again. "This isn't just about Haley," he told a packed press conference, Scout at his feet. "It's about every family that deserves a chance. You never stop fighting for the people you love." David stood beside him, sometimes still stunned by the sudden shift, from hunted to herd, from powerless to empowered. He'd never wanted to be the center of a crusade, but the gratitude he felt for Scout, for Dr. Williams, for the community, gave him a new kind of strength. Together, the Parkers faced the glare of the media, never letting Haley's story become just another headline. "We're not here for revenge," David told one reporter. "We just want change. We want to make sure no other family is ever told to give up too soon." Dr. Williams, too, found herself under the spotlight. Called to testify before the hospital board, she spoke candidly of what she'd witnessed: the courage of a family, the uncanny instincts of a dog, and the failures of a system too eager to close the book. "I stand by my decision," she said. "Protocols exist to protect us, but they can also blind us. Sometimes you need to listen to a patient, to a family, even to a dog, when the data alone isn't enough." The hearing room was packed. Staff, journalists, parents, and a handful of hospital executives nervously shuffling papers. Dr. Reed, pale and rigid, sat flanked by his attorney, trying to defend his actions. He insisted he had always acted in Haley's best interest. But as the evidence piled up, notes about rushed DNRs, testimony from nurses about pressure to sign off on hopeless cases, a pattern of ignoring families' wishes, his words rang hollow. The most damning moment came when a whistleblower produced an email exchange showing Reed had discouraged further diagnostics in Haley's case, citing cost and likelihood of futility. The room went silent as the investigator read aloud. "Had the family listened, Haley would be buried right now." A shiver passed through everyone in attendance. Even the hardest skeptics had no defense left. By week's end, the board had no choice but to act. Dr. Reed was placed on immediate suspension, pending the outcome of a full investigation. The announcement triggered cheers in the hospital lobby, where families had gathered for news. Reed left through a side entrance, avoiding cameras, his legacy shattered. The hospital, reeling from public scrutiny, moved swiftly to begin damage control. They offered to cover all costs of Haley's ongoing care and rehabilitation. New training sessions for staff were launched, focused on family-centered care, transparency, and the inclusion of service animals in critical care protocols. Dr. Williams was asked to lead a task force on integrating animal-assisted interventions. Her former insubordination, now hailed as visionary. But the greatest victory was for the Parker family. Mike, once dogged by his parole record and past mistakes, was publicly cleared of all suspicion. In a heartfelt moment outside the hospital, the local police chief presented Mike with a certificate of appreciation for his courage and advocacy. "You saved more than your niece," the chief said quietly. "You reminded this town what it means to fight for what's right." David and Mike, their family bonds tested and reforged in the fires of crisis, found a new sense of brotherhood. For the first time in years, they sat together over coffee. Not just as two men sharing the burden of pain, but as a team with a shared mission. They began to talk about the future. Not just Haley's, but the futures of all the children and families who might need a champion. And at the center of it all was Scout. The town council voted unanimously to declare a special day in his honor, Scout Day, to recognize his bravery and the lesson he'd taught everyone about listening to instinct and never giving up hope. On a crisp Saturday morning, the mayor placed a medal around Scout's neck in front of a cheering crowd. Local kids lined up for photos, and news crews broadcast the story nationwide. Hero Dog honored in miracle comeback. For Haley, who was steadily regaining her strength, the celebration felt like a dream. She clung to Scout's neck, whispering secrets and laughter, her eyes shining with life. She would face challenges ahead. Rehab would be long and hard. But the hardest battles were behind her now. Her family, her town, and her loyal friend had carried her through the darkness. They had demanded justice, and against the odds, they had won. And so, as Riverest began to heal, a sense of hope rippled out from Haley's hospital room. Justice had been served, and a little girl's heartbeat, once lost in the silence, now echoed through every corner of the community, a reminder that courage, loyalty, and love could change the world. The first hints of spring swept through Riverest, melting the stubborn patches of snow that clung to the curbs and corners of the town. After months of cold and crisis, the sunlight felt like a benediction, gentle, golden, and full of possibility. For the Parkers, it was as if the whole world was waking up along with Haley. Rehabilitation was both a blessing and a new battle. Haley's body, weak from weeks of immobility, trembled through her first steps with the help of parallel bars and a patient team of therapists. The journey was painstaking, with moments of pain and frustration, but also of stubborn, triumphant joy. Each small victory, a lifted spoon, a wobbly step, the first time she laughed at a therapist's corny joke, was met with applause and sometimes tears from her family and the staff who had rooted for her from the beginning. Scout was always there, shadowing Haley from room to room, nudging her hand when she faltered, barking in encouragement when she managed something new. The hospital staff quickly learned that progress accelerated when Scout was present. Physical therapists started inviting Scout into other pediatric sessions, hoping his quiet magic would inspire their patients too. Mike and David, finally united, poured their energies into supporting Haley's recovery. Mike took charge of her daily routines, turning each exercise into a mini-mission, Operation Supergirl he called it, while David cheered her on, his love and pride growing with every milestone. Even Dr. Williams, no longer fighting for Haley's right to live but for her right to thrive, made time for daily visits, encouraging Haley to reach further, to keep believing. But as Haley's world expanded beyond the hospital walls, so did her family's mission. The outpouring of support from Riverest and beyond had been overwhelming. Donations, letters, care packages, even a flood of hand-drawn cards from children in schools across the state. Many families who visited or reached out had similar stories. A loved one who'd needed someone to fight for them, a pet who'd seemed to know things no doctor could explain, a moment when hope had seemed like the only thing left. One evening, as the family gathered around Haley's hospital bed for her favorite bedtime story, she asked, "Can Scout help other kids too?" David glanced at Mike, who smiled softly. The idea took root immediately. blossoming into something they hadn't dared to dream before. Giving back, turning suffering into service, and honoring the dog who had saved their family. Within weeks, the Parkers founded Haley's Hope, a non-profit dedicated to training rescued German Shepherds as medical alert and therapy dogs for children facing serious illness or disability. Their vision was simple. Every child deserved a champion, and every family deserved hope. The first goal was ambitious but clear: raise funds to train and place at least 10 service dogs in local hospitals and schools within a year. The response from the community was immediate and enthusiastic. The hospital offered its auditorium for a launch event. Volunteers showed up to help with everything from logistics to social media. Scout became the organization's first mascot and living proof of what animal loyalty and intuition could achieve. News crews returned to Riverest, this time to tell a story of triumph and generosity instead of scandal and strife. On the morning of the first Haley's Hope fundraiser, the air was electric. The auditorium was decorated with children's artwork, paintings of dogs, rainbows, and hearts. There were tables piled with homemade cookies, lemonade stands manned by local Girl Scouts, and a giant banner painted by Haley and her friends: "Never give up, hope lives here." Families gathered with their children, some in wheelchairs, some on crutches, all united by the promise of a new beginning. Scout, wearing a blue vest embroidered with his name and a bright gold medal from Scout Day, sat at the center of it all. Haley, now able to walk short distances with her cane, stood beside him at the podium, her cheeks flushed with excitement. David, his voice steady with pride, welcomed everyone. "When we thought we'd lost everything, this town, this hospital, and this amazing dog gave us hope. Now we want to do the same for others. Every dog we train, every child we help, carries a piece of this miracle forward." The event was a runaway success. Local businesses pledged donations. The mayor announced the creation of a town scholarship fund for kids with disabilities. Dr. Williams gave a speech about the medical research now being conducted on animal-assisted intervention, highlighting Haley's case as an example of the power of empathy and intuition in medicine. As the crowd thinned and evening settled over the town, Haley and Scout made their way down the hospital corridor, hand in paw. Staff and families clapped and cheered. But for Haley, the moment was quiet. Just her and her best friend, moving forward together. That night, as Haley lay in bed at home for the first time in months, she stroked Scout's fur and whispered, "We did it, buddy. We're not just survivors. We're helpers now." Scout thumped his tail, as if he understood every word. The next weeks were a blur of joyful chaos. Scout's story brought more volunteers and donations, and applications poured in from families across the state, desperate for the kind of hope Haley's family had found. Mike, who'd once wondered if he had a place in the world, discovered his purpose helping other veterans train dogs for service work. Lila, the nurse who'd risked her job for Haley, became the nonprofit's community outreach leader, teaching schools and hospitals about animal therapy and patient advocacy. Dr. Williams, now a national speaker on medical innovation, started a research project tracking the outcomes of children paired with service dogs. She published the first results in a leading medical journal, citing Haley and Scout as the inspiration. Hospitals and medical schools began inviting her to train staff and present the Riverest case. How listening, empathy, and sometimes a little fur could mean the difference between despair and a miracle. By the end of spring, Haley had returned to her classroom, Scout proudly trotting beside her, both now symbols of courage for an entire community. Children waved from the playground, teachers stopped to say hello, and parents brought treats for the town's hero dog, and in living rooms across Riverist, families gathered to watch the story of Haley and Scout retold on national television. A story not of tragedy, but of redemption, service, and the quiet heroism of never giving up. The Parkers had found their calling. The pain of the past would never disappear, but it had been transformed into action, into hope, into a future where every child could have their own Scout, and every parent could believe again. And as Riverist bloomed into a new season, the miracle at its heart kept growing. One wagging tail, one helping hand, and one never-quit heartbeat at a time. Long after the banners had been folded, the hospital lights dimmed, and the final applause faded, the Parker family found themselves at the heart of a quieter, deeper transformation. The miracle that had brought Haley back, and the battles that followed, left a permanent mark, not just on one family, but on the whole of Riverist. As the seasons changed and life slowly settled into a new rhythm, moments of reflection came more often, sometimes catching David or Mike off guard in the middle of the simplest days. It was early summer when David, sitting on the porch swing with Haley dozing in his lap and Scout curled at their feet, found himself wrestling with a flood of memories. Pain, disbelief, guilt, wonder, and a humility that cut deeper than grief. He watched the shadows shift across the yard and remembered those impossible hours in the hospital, the way hope had almost drowned under the weight of science, policy, and fear. Mike joined him, bringing 2 mugs of coffee and settling into the seat beside his brother. For a long time they sat in companionable silence, the cicadas buzzing in the warm twilight, Scout's ears flicking at every distant sound. Finally, it was Haley's soft, sleepy voice that broke the spell. "Daddy, how come you never gave up?" David swallowed, looking down at her earnest face. Because sometimes, even when everyone says no, you have to listen to the voice inside that says try again. And sometimes, you have to listen to your dog. Haley giggled and reached for Scout, who nuzzled her gently, as if to say he agreed. As the days went by, the Parkers realized their story had become a touchstone for others, a kind of survival guide. Letters arrived from parents across the country. Some had lost children, some were still fighting for them. Most wrote about doubt, the way it crept in when doctors delivered impossible news, the loneliness of being told there was nothing left to do. David tried to answer each one, sometimes with advice, sometimes with nothing more than the simple truth. You're not alone. Trust your love and trust your instincts. It became clear that Haley's journey had stirred something larger in Riverist, too. Town hall meetings, once sleepy affairs, now filled with voices demanding more transparency in healthcare. The hospital formed a new patient advocacy board, inviting parents and even former patients to help shape policy. There was a surge of volunteers for Haley's Hope, and Scout's training program inspired similar initiatives in other towns and states. Riverist, a place long known for stubborn tradition, had found a new identity, a community that listened, questioned, and supported one another, especially when hope was on the line. But the story's lessons went even deeper. Sitting around the dinner table one night, the family tried to put words to what they'd learned. First, no system, no matter how advanced, is infallible. Even experts can be wrong, blinded by protocol, fatigue, or fear of liability. Dr. Reed's story was a warning. When decisions become automatic, the cost is always human. The Parkers had been lucky. Others might not be. It wasn't about villainy, but about humility. Recognizing that even the best training doesn't replace vigilance, compassion, or listening to voices outside the norm. Second, instincts and empathy matter, If Scout hadn't barked, if Mike hadn't trusted his gut, if David hadn't risked looking foolish in front of a crowd, Haley would never have come home. Sometimes a parent's intuition, or a dog's unwavering loyalty, sees what machines and data miss. Williams had put it best. Science and love don't have to be rivals. Sometimes they work best when they work together. Third, courage is contagious. The Parkers had felt utterly alone in the beginning, but their refusal to give up inspired others. Nurses who risked their jobs, community members who stood vigil in the cold, families who told their stories at last. Mike, who had always carried his own scars, found unexpected healing in the fight. It took more than one voice to save Haley, he told a crowd at a hospital seminar. Don't let anyone silence yours. Fourth, redemption and second chances are possible, for everyone. Mike's return to the family had been messy, painful, but ultimately redemptive. Reed's downfall had led to overdue changes at the hospital. David's own sense of failure was transformed, not by erasing mistakes, but by the chance to fight again, better and braver than before. Scout's journey from wounded stray to hero became a metaphor for anyone who'd ever been counted out or left behind. Fifth, community is strength. The Parkers learned that private suffering could become public hope if people stood together. Riverist's response, vigils, petitions, donations, shared meals, turned isolation into connection and fear into action. In time, families from neighboring towns joined the cause, forging new bonds and making the kind of systemic changes no single person could accomplish alone. As summer blossomed and the Scout Day parade drew near, Haley's recovery continued. Her steps grew more confident, her laughter brighter. She and Scout led the local kids' relay race, cheers echoing across the field. David watched her and felt a peace he hadn't known in years, a gratitude born from having stood at the brink and survived. Sometimes, late at night, he and Mike would sit out under the stars, talking about the future. You know, Mike mused, maybe this is the real miracle, finding out we're stronger than we thought, that we matter not because we're perfect, but because we keep showing up. David nodded. And maybe miracles aren't always loud. Maybe they're quiet, like a heartbeat you almost miss, or a dog who just won't quit. The last and perhaps most profound lesson was this: never accept there's nothing left to do as the end. There is always one more question, one more hand to hold, one more voice to raise. In that way, Haley's story became a call to action for anyone tempted to give in to despair. The impact rippled outward. Medical journals published Williams' findings. Schools brought in therapy dogs for children with anxiety and chronic illness. Hospitals across the region revised protocols to ensure families' voices were never overlooked. Even Dr. Reed, after months of self-reflection and counseling, publicly apologized and began working with a medical ethics group, seeking to prevent future tragedies. Back at home, the Parkers honored the past without letting it define their future. They gathered each night to share stories, not just about suffering, but about survival, courage, and the magic of refusing to let go. Scout, aging but still vigilant, remained Haley's shadow and the unofficial guardian of every child who passed through the Parker home. And so, as the summer days grew long and the world outside their door seemed a little brighter, the Parkers kept listening for the faintest heartbeat in the silence, and for the call to become someone else's miracle when hope seemed out of reach. Winter returned to Riverist with a hush, wrapping the town in blankets of fresh snow, frosting the trees and rooftops in white. The air, crisp and silent, felt new, like the world had finally exhaled after months of holding its breath. For the Parker family, this was more than just another season. It was the first anniversary of a miracle. It was a reminder of what had been lost, and more importantly, what had been found. The town now marked the day with a new tradition. Scout Day brought neighbors together in the town square, each person clutching a candle or a small bell, their breath rising in clouds as they listened to stories of hope and healing. Children, bundled in scarves and mittens, ran circles around the statue that now stood near the park entrance, a bronze German shepherd, strong and proud, with a little girl's hand resting on his neck. Below, the plaque read, "For every voice that refuses to be silenced, for every heartbeat that's almost missed." On that bright winter morning, Haley stood at the edge of the snow-dusted park, her cane in one hand and the other buried deep in Scout's thick fur. She moved slowly, carefully, but with a confidence that had taken months to earn. Every step was a promise to herself and to all those who had cheered her on. Scout, graying now, matched her pace, nose to the wind, eyes shining with the wisdom of 1,000 silent vigils. David watched his daughter with quiet awe, the memories of that impossible year playing through his mind like scenes from a movie. He remembered the funeral, the chaos, the world's collective gasp as Scout leaped onto the coffin. He remembered the nights by Haley's hospital bed, the battles with doctors, the news crews and petitions and prayers. But more than anything, he remembered the moment Haley first said, "Scout," her voice pulling them all back from the edge. He remembered the day hope came alive again. Now, as the town gathered for the second annual Scout Day, David and Mike took the small stage with Haley and Scout beside them. Mike spoke first, his voice rough but steady, telling the crowd what the journey had meant for their family, their town, and quietly, for himself. "I used to think second chances were for other people," he said, glancing at Haley, then at Scout. "But Riverist gave us one. And this dog taught us all that sometimes. You have to bark until the world listens." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but tears were not far behind. David stepped forward, cradling the microphone with hands that had once trembled with grief, but now held only gratitude. "We learned that change doesn't start big. It starts small, sometimes with a stubborn kid, sometimes with a dog who won't let go. You don't need to be a doctor or a hero to make a difference. You just have to care enough not to quit." When Haley spoke, the square fell into reverent silence. "Scout saved me," she said, her voice clear and bright in the cold air. "He listened when no one else did. Now I want to help other kids and other dogs find their voice too." That legacy had already begun to blossom. Haley's hope had grown far beyond the Parkers' wildest dreams. Dozens of rescued German shepherds, each with a story as scarred and beautiful as Scout's, had been paired with children in need, children living with epilepsy, diabetes, trauma, or the scars of loss. Trained by volunteers, guided by Mike and other veterans, these dogs became companions, protectors, and sometimes lifesavers. The foundation hosted workshops for parents and hospital staff, teaching the power of animal-assisted care. Haley and Scout became regular visitors at hospitals and schools, offering hope to kids whose days were often filled with fear and pain. Each visit was a living reminder that courage could be quiet, and that sometimes just being there was enough. Dr. Williams, whose advocacy had changed the course of Haley's life, published a groundbreaking study on the medical benefits of therapy and service dogs. Her research, now cited in journals and conferences nationwide, proved what the Parkers and so many others already knew. Sometimes, science and heart could work together. More hospitals began revising their protocols, opening their doors and minds to the lessons of Riverist. Even Dr. Reed, after his suspension and a year of reflection, returned to speak at a hospital ethics panel. "I was wrong to dismiss hope," he admitted, voice trembling. "Protocols keep us safe, but they can also blind us. I will never again let policy outweigh compassion." But perhaps the greatest legacy was less about systems and more about spirit. Across Riverist, neighbors checked on one another more often. Families reached out for help and offered it in return. Kids wrote essays about bravery, drawing pictures of Scout and Haley as superheroes. Scout Day became not just a holiday, but a symbol, a promise that no voice, however small, would be lost in the silence again. The Parkers still gathered each night around the kitchen table, telling stories, some old, some new, all laced with gratitude. Haley, stronger now, read her own books aloud, Scout's head in her lap. Mike, now leading veteran dog training full-time, would sometimes catch David watching them, tears glinting in his eyes. "Still gets you, huh?" Mike would tease. David only nodded, every single day. One afternoon, Haley and Scout walked the snowy path through the park, the statue in sight. She paused, looking back at her father and uncle. "Dad, do you think other kids feel alone like I did?" David's throat tightened. "Sometimes, but maybe now fewer of them will, because of you, because of Scout." Haley knelt by the statue, pressing her hand to the cold bronze paw. "Thank you," she whispered, not just to the statue, but to the past, the pain, and the dog beside her. Scout wagged his tail, as if to say, "You're welcome. We did this together." In the end, Haley's story was no longer just about loss or even survival. It was about the ripples a single act of faith could create. The way a child's heartbeat, heard by a stubborn dog and a family that refused to give up, could awaken a whole town. It was about how ordinary people could change the world, not with grand gestures, but by refusing to let the quietest voices be ignored. As the sun set over Riverist, casting long shadows across the snow, Haley and Scout walked side by side, symbols of hope, loyalty, and the life-changing power of listening to the faintest heartbeat in the silence. Their story, once a private pain, now belonged to everyone who believed that miracles begin with a single, determined act of love. And that was the real legacy. Not the statue, or the headlines, or even the foundation, but the promise that every life matters, every voice deserves to be heard, and that hope, once awakened, can never truly die.